Juist in deze onzekere tijden is het belangrijk om elkaar te blijven ontmoeten, te informeren en te inspireren over hoe we het morgen slimmer en beter kunnen doen. Welkom bij de livecast van Pakhuis de Zwijger.
Good evening and welcome on behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger and Salto at this new episode of our Metromix series on urban planning and mixed-use functions. Previous weeks we've been talking about mixed-use functions in the Netherlands. Last week we've been focusing on how to make space for the more controversial functions. And tonight we're gonna cross the borders to new territory. And well, we hope to get inspired by international examples of mixed-use planning. My name is Nienke. I'll be your moderator for tonight. And we're going to talk about world cities in the mix. And I'll do that tonight with 4 guests. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce them to you because they're all, well, very experienced guests on this topic. Through Zoom, we have 2 international experts on architecture and urban planning. Alejandro Echeverri, an architect and urban planner from Medellin, Colombia, and director of Urbanism Center for Urban and Environmental Studies at EAFIT University, Colombia. Welcome, Alejandro. Well, actually, good afternoon, is it for you?
Yes, welcome.
Great.
And thank you for the invitation, Linka.
Yeah, great you're joining. Thank you. And also from the UK, Tim Stoner. Architect, urban planner and managing director of Space Syntax. Welcome, Tim.
Good evening, Ninka. Nice to be here. How are you?
I'm great. And you?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you. And here in the studio we have 2 Dutch, well, not Dutch, but in the Netherlands-based architects and urban planners. Paula Huiding, a Dutch-Brazilian urban planner and architect and founder of Vulpi Urbana. Currently working for the municipality of Almere.
That's right.
And on my right, Marina Otero-Vergier. Many nice names tonight. Rotterdam-based architect and head of social design at the Design Academy Eindhoven. Well, great the 4 of you could join us tonight. And of course, you can join as well. You can do that by going to the website, log on to Zoom, and just by the Q&A button, you can, direct your questions to the speakers in the studio. I would really recommend you to do so. We're gonna talk about international examples of mixed-use urban areas and how the cities benefit from that. Tim, let's start with you. According to you, how is mixed-use planning changing the current global landscape?
Well, it's having a huge effect. Or maybe I could start by explaining why I think it's so important, because on the one hand, mixed-use planning sounds a bit technical, but in fact, I think it's about being able to walk to the shops, to work near where you live, to be able to go out for one thing and do many other things on the way. And I guess that might sound obvious to people living in the middle of Amsterdam or London or where I live. But for over 100 years, we've been zoning our cities into living zones and shopping zones and office zones, which are often far apart from each other. And that creates a lot of cost, and it requires cars to connect them. And if we're looking to tackle climate change, we need to do things differently, reduce our carbon footprint, and that means walking and cycling. And to do that, you have to mix the uses.
Yeah, and apparently it's happening worldwide.
Everywhere I'm working, this is the target. This is the goal. This is the changing time that we're in, and it's very exciting because the day of the car is over, and the day of walking and the day of cycling is just beginning. And I think that should excite all of us.
Yeah. Well, cycling, we do a lot here in the Netherlands. Thank you. Marina, what do you see happening globally when you look at mixed functioned areas, projects, buildings?
Yeah, I agree with What was said already, I think we have been seeing a transformation that is leaving behind the modernist idea of the city. So in a way, what happens during the 20th century was that the medieval house that was like a productive house that will have the living quarters, but also space for commerce, a space for production, that was kind of pile up. And during the modernism, the times of modern movement, those things were put aside and became parts of the city. So they will become in zoning, quarters for inhabitation, quarters for production, leisure, etc. And that was the paradigm that was used for creating a more hygienic and safe city, separating work and living. But we have seen that that is not the paradigm anymore, that we are not only working in factories and then living elsewhere, that now production, consumption, and living are all interconnected. And therefore, this idea of stacking and piling functions is coming back. Not like in the 19th century, but in the renewed forms. But I think this is what is happening, like the transformation, horizontal organization of the city based on zoning and rational thinking is being, transformed into something much more interconnected and vibrant, I would say.
Yeah, and what are we trying to achieve when we combine all those things?
Yeah, I think realize that this idea of zoning was perhaps interesting for certain moments in which the sites of production were heavily polluting and was needed to create other spaces where living could be safer and healthier. But right now, what we are looking is the opposite. We are thinking that in terms to be more efficient in consumption, in energy resources, etc., we have to create spaces that are dependent or self-dependent in many different ways, that you don't need to bring the potatoes or the food from far away. You can go to your office walking or by bike, as we said. So that means that questions of closeness, distance, and the different interconnections is more important. And equally, I think there's a question of intergenerational living that we can discuss later, perhaps. What
do you mean by that?
In certain cultures, it's much more usual that there is a coexistence between different generations in the same area or even in the same household. Yeah. But in others, there is a very strict separation between, young people, people of middle age, and elderly people.
I would say so that here in Holland, it's that.
Is that the case in the Netherlands? Yeah. And in many cases, we thought, okay, the elderly people should be in elderly houses, and we have been designing them to be the most efficient. But now we know that people benefit for interconnection and the mixing of different generations in a neighborhood, because everyone benefits from each other. So that's something that has been at the core of many cultures. For instance, where I'm from, like having your grandparents at home is quite
and you're
usual.
From Spain.
Spain is something that perhaps is being considered also in other spaces, like in North European countries that were not used to have that mix. So I think it's a mix happening in terms of programmatic, also in terms of generational, and we can expand later also in terms of humans and more than humans.
Wow, you're way ahead. So we're not only talking about mixing of functions, but much, much more. Nice. So yeah, let's have a look at the different cases the four of you have been working on. Alejandro, you're based in Medellin. You've been working a lot on developing that city. Maybe it's nice, maybe you can start with giving us an outline of what Colombian cities look like.
Yes, in this moment, this is a very special moment because the crisis, the COVID, and so we have been in some crisis before, and always the crisis helped to put the answers and the questions on the table, and give visibility to the challenges of the cities. So Colombian cities, like many others in the global south, are very diverse and with high contradictions inside. You find different process, emergent contrast as well. And we have a very big problem about the inclusion of how to develop a more inclusive city, more connected city, and as well how to integrate the environment, the connections, the natural corridors, and so on. So our cities always, we are in a very dynamic scenario, very dynamic situation, like I imagine in other cities in the world. But at the same time, the different social classes and the different capacity of the institutions give I don't know if I say a fragile processes, but at the same time are very beautiful and intense. We have the people are, I think, and this contrast give us cities with a lot of color and capacity, and so it's like go forward for the future and go back for the challenges that we have and we always have in terms of inclusion and equity.
Yeah. So you say there are many challenges. The cities are very diverse. In what way is mixing functions a common way of solving problems?
See, you were talking about these situations, zonification and zoning, and we have as well because part of our cities grow from informal processes, close to the 40%. It's not informal, but the beginning of the city on those places start informal as well. So that give you the challenge that you have to include a lot of different parts of the cities in terms of how they could be fractured, separate, like with a lot of frontiers between different barrios and different formal and urban forms in the city.
So then the challenge would be then to connect those.
Yeah, the biggest challenge is how to connect and how to connect in different forms, not only physically, but at the same time in programs and in different social services, and how give you process of how to flow through the city with a more efficient way at the same time.
And why is that so important?
Because the distances in terms of the physical capacity of the mobility, in terms of how to the difficulty to reach some parts of our city, for example, in Medellin, that close to the 40% of the barrios are located in the hills, and many of them are growing formally. So the streets and the continuity of the urban fabric is not there. So you have to develop and innovate in terms of mobility, new public services and new public transport systems like the cable car or electric escalators, of corridors in the informal areas to connect the barrios. And at the same time, it's very important where you locate the public services in terms of to be very strategic, to develop a very powerful point of encounters that could mix uses and could mix society. And for us is part of our necessity and to develop in that way.
So am I right that as an urban planner, you actually have to facilitate the mixing and the diversity in for example, Medellin?
Yeah. And when I am talking about diversity, I am talking at the same time about cultural diversity. Medellin is the city of Medellin, and the people from Medellin came from different parts of Colombia. Colombia culturally is very diverse in terms of the people from the Atlantic coast, from the Andes Mountains, from the Pacific, and so on. And our cities are are very attractive, and at the same time, because the violence of the country and the city, the process were explosive in the last years. And so how to develop a city that could include different cultures, different music, different flavors, but at the same time, different social classes is very important and is part of the agenda.
But that sounds like a huge challenge for an urban planner.
Of course, never ends. always is dynamic. You always do something and then appear a new challenge. But this is the reality.
And how did you start? What was your starting point?
So we developed a strategy that we call social urbanism. And this strategy defined to locate strategic areas that has some very deep problems of inequality and violence. We locate there processes that combine a physical transformation in terms of public spaces, houses, public transport systems, at the same time with programs that are very important for us, like education, culture, and innovation. So we develop a very precise action, not in all the city, but in a very strategic areas to increase the capacity of the government and how to develop with communities process of collaboration to transform a very key parts of those spaces of centralities, and locate there and connect them with a new public transport systems. So this is a strategy that take times, but we follow step by step. But I cannot say that Medellin has the problems solved. We still have structural problems, and we continue. And the challenge today is huge too, in terms of the question that we have.
Yeah, and do you involve the local people?
We always. This is the most important thing, and it's not easy to do that. But when
how do you do it?
When we are talking about urban processes, we are talking mainly about people histories. So one thing that is very important is that the target is not the project. For us, and I think everywhere as well, the target is how those processes could change the people's lives. So we have different processes, but the most important and more sustainable programs and projects that we have, if you take a picture today, after 15 or 10 years in those projects, the processes that start with more collaboration, with more faces, with different actors from the beginning, and working with them, giving the histories of the peoples and the barrios, giving light and empower those histories with the new programs and public spaces. Those processes today are more sustainable and are growing. And for us, it's very important. And those lessons are very clear in our city. So if you found and you start and you design the process from the beginning with many different institutions, actors, and many different and strong participation, those processes in our context that it is very fragile in terms of politics, those processes are more important and more sustainable. And of course, the people give life in the time with the programs if they participate from the beginning with a clear role. So there are different forms to develop those processes.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Paula? You've been studying a lot Latin American cities. Do you agree?
Now, I did a lot of study of the urban legislation of Brazil, and the Brazilian cities are complex and from the cultural point of view, extremely rich. If we like to understand the Brazilian cities and the challenge the Brazilian cities are facing nowadays, quite similar of what Alejandro just mentioned. But if you understand that it's a young country, 5 centuries, and the 3 first centuries Brazil has been a colony of Portugal. So there were no interest in developing the cities. The cities had only the function of administration of the extraction of natural sources that will be sent to Portugal. Actually, only in the beginning of the 20th centuries, we start to see, in the period of colonization, the one doing the work were enslaved African. So 5 million African people went to Brazil to work actually in the extraction of the natural resources. And that means actually that their culture is very strong rooted in the Brazilian culture. That is one aspect. When starting the 20th century, there was a huge immigration during the 50s and 80s of 80 million people going to the cities. So people were leaving the rural areas, going to the cities, looking for a better job, a school for the children. But the cities had absolutely no infrastructure, no transportation, no housing. So in Brazil, urbanization and slum formation go hand in hand. And that is very important to understand because in this case, it means that the legislation in Brazil for urban development guarantees the right to the city. It is a law that took 13 years to do by means of participation. So civil society, knowledge institutes, the government, they were all working together to set up a legislation for urban transformation, of urban development. And
so it's really a cooperation.
It is really a cooperation, and the participation is actually a safeguard in the, for instance, the zoning plan of a city. So,
is this what we see here?
Now, this is just the trajectory actually from the city statute was ready in 2001. To guarantee actually the execution of the legislation, they set up a whole ministry for the cities, and then also a system with city council. I see that the slide is in Dutch, but a city council actually to keep this process going on. And if you have to understand also that the people live in Brazil, 80% of the people live in Brazil, 4 of 5 people live in Brazil. So it's a huge actually challenge to get the rights to the city to everyone, to get that in a sustainable way, to finance all the transformation that is needed in the cities. And we see that nowadays, since certainly for 10 years, the mixed use has been used actually a strategy to regeneration of old areas.
It was really a strategy.
It is a strategy, and if we see, for instance, in São Paulo, the regeneration of the center area, what is funny to see is that all the Brazilian cities went through the same process. You have the city center, and then do it to the development of new areas. Economical activities live from the center, people live in the center, live from there, and so you get a empty area that degenerates. The strategy of the city center of São Paulo was based on the zoning plan, is that the municipality said, of the local government said, we're going to bring back our offices to the city center. So a lot of people was going back to the center to work there. And if you work there, you need to have lunch, you have restaurants, you have shops, you have improvement of the transport system. They invest a lot in the regeneration improvement of the public spaces. And then they start using, and that is one of the images here, they start to use also instruments and zoning plan to promote actually the refurbishing of existing buildings that were abandoned or they were
how did
squatted.
they do that? How did they implement the mixed?
Now, actually, if you have a building that there is no use, they have a fiscal system that asking to the owner of the building to develop that, to refurbish, and if it's an empty plot, to gonna build. And if you don't do that in 5 years, the tax is gonna be higher and higher, so the cost to maintain the empty building is too high. And at the end, they also can disappropriate the property, something that actually we also know in the Netherlands. But very interesting is that different parties need to work together, and the financial part is one of the most difficult. How to finance actually the new structure in this regeneration of the area. So what they did in São Paulo, they said what you can build in the whole city is the same square meters of the plot. For instance, if your plot is 1,000 square meters, you are allowed to build 1,000 square meters, with the exception of the areas around the public transportation, something that we also know, the transit-oriented development. You can build more in these areas, and in the center of the neighborhoods. But what is interesting is that in the center of the neighborhoods, if we could have the next image, please, is that you can build twice the area of the plot till 28 meters. But if you like to build more, you are allowed to, but then you have to buy the right to build more, and that money goes to a fund, and that money is meant to improve for instance, public space in the neighborhood, or to integrate functions. So
because with that money, the whole neighborhood improves.
That is the way of improve. And if we could go to the next image, I made some. Oh, and it's funny because that is an instrument that has been used in São Paulo, but also in Rio to generate, for instance, heritage and in the new redevelopment of the old area of Port of Rio.
And is this very specific for Brazil?
That is specific from Brazil, as long as I know. And it is actually, the city statute has these 23 instruments at a national level, and each city in Brazil has its own city statute according to the needs that they need, and the zoning plan, specifically for the city development, is one of these instruments. And they have also the financial and fiscal instruments integrated in that to make possible that the transformation can be financed. It works because a lot of areas are being actually financed by this kind of funding. So what this image see that if you want to have the right to build more, you are allowed to. You pay for the extra building volume and that money will be actually used for implementing infrastructure, public spaces, and also to integrate functions in private buildings that the community could use.
But does the community benefit from it? Can you feel it when you're on the streets?
Of course, because you have, with the mix of the functions, first, the public spaces are much better to be used. There is more infrastructure, mobility, public transportation is improved. And also, if you have a new development, you can actually, they have a system that if you want to build more, you don't have to pay to build more, as long as you introduce in your program of your building functions that the community could benefit. For instance, you have a kindergarten, you have a health center, you have a community center, and that's the way actually to deal with the financing of social infrastructure that the neighborhood can benefit. Yeah. And I like very much to end with these images because we have to understand that this kind of transformations or development cannot be only done by one party. It's not only the local government, it's not only the real estate developers, but give also the voice to the ones that can benefit, and also bottom-up initiatives.
Because what do we see here on this image?
Funny. This is a viaduct that goes through the center of São Paulo, just a horror infrastructure that just cut at the center of São Paulo, and the people living there decided that the traffic should stop there, and they got now so far that in any way in the weekends the viaduct is closed for cars. So it is just open space where all kind of cultural activities can take place. And now that the link is with traffic and the red is without traffic, and the local government agree now that they're going to transform this viaduct into a park. So put everybody together, working together. Government, real estate investment, give the instruments to finance the transformation, not being only depending of private money, of government money, and give the voice to the ones that can benefit of the transformation in a way that actually they will be feeling honor actually also of the area.
Yeah.
So that's what I learned from this project of 4 or 5 years in Brazil. Yeah.
Very interesting. We're going to talk about what we here in the Netherlands can maybe learn from it later on. Tim, I would like to go to you. You've been hearing this story about Sao Paulo. Is an example a good example, you reckon?
I think it is, yes. I think this is the situation all over the world. I've been working in many different countries for many years, and there's a common challenge which usually has 4 wheels and 1 person in it, which is the car, which has overtaken our cities and dominated in a way that historically was never the case. And cars are allowed to drive too quickly. The streets are allowed to become too wide and dominated by cars. And so projects like the ones we've just seen, where the city can be reclaimed with public space, are very much the way in which cities are now learning to transform themselves. And in doing so, another element is planting trees to shade the streets, to make it comfortable to walk in the heat, to reduce the cold winds in the winter. Yeah. And we're seeing nature returning into our cities as well. If I can just add that as another element, which was certainly the case in the project in Nur Sultan that we've just been working on, where we were trying to bring all of these things across an entire city.
What was the challenge in Nur Sultan?
Well, it begins with the car. And if I can share my slides with you, I could take you briefly through how we started with a city where car dependence dominated, and there was a belief by some people that this city, which has a very cold winter, very hot summer.
Because this is in Kazakhstan, right?
This is the capital city of Kazakhstan, Nur Sultan, yeah. And you can see it has an architecture of the capital city, but it's dominated by vehicles. And the younger generation especially was saying, look, we don't want to live our lives in traffic jams. We don't want to be in cars. We want to be able to walk, and we want to use that space. And so the city held a competition, and we were invited to bid for the planning of the city. And there was an assumption in the competition that the city would grow. So in this image here, which is a plan of the existing city, the red route is the public transport. And our initial idea was to take the existing public transport and create, as we've just heard from Paola, transit-oriented development to grow the public transport and grow the city. And we entered the competition with a vision of the future, which was built around public transport, around boulevards, and these spines that would be the locations for new shops and offices, and then behind them, parks and quiet streets where people could live a short walk away. And it's a mixed-use vision. And we won the competition. And then when we got to know the city, we realized that we couldn't just assume that the city should grow. It might need to, but we actually changed our view, and we went back and said, look, there are parts of the city where the basic infrastructure of walking, never mind cycling, is just not there. So we looked again and we said, let's identify the main streets here in red, where we're going to focus the same kind of approach we had in our competition around boulevards, but we're going to put them in the existing city first. and we're going to improve and intensify the existing city before we start building the new city. And that took some time, but eventually through discussion with local business, with local leadership, local communities, that was the plan that we moved forward with. And what that means is taking these wide streets filled with cars and giving back space. So in this image here, we're seeing a street which is lined by 4-story buildings, lined by trees. We introduce cycle paths, and you can see a bus route. And if you like, as you know, in the Netherlands, these are the basic elements of a good street: a place to cycle, a place to catch public transport. But in so many other cities in the world, they're not the case. And so our vision is a vision of people first, certainly cars, but cars very far behind. Walking, cycling,
so
public transport.
Was quite a
private car.
Big change there in Nur Sultan for the citizens.
Yeah, it is a big change, and it's the kind of comprehensive change which is needed to reduce the carbon footprint of cities, and mixed-use planning is fundamental for that. But it's the kind of change as well that can begin with one business putting a bench in front of its shop and putting a place to seat. And rather than a great project of a tunnel or a bridge or a motorway network, it's actually a series of little projects which are more at the human scale.
Yeah, have a much more detailed view, actually, on the scale of the streets, even. Yeah. Marina, I would like to go to you. Sorry, it's been a while. I'm sorry for that. So you also brought some cases where you could see the mixed-use functions.
Yeah, maybe there is a case also to continue with Sao Paulo. Well, I brought this one. I think it's one of my favorite buildings and architects. It's Lina Bobardi.
And this is in Sao Paulo as well.
And this is in Sao Paulo, and it's a fantastic project and infrastructure. It's a leisure center. Actually, they use the word leisure, not to use culture or sport facilities, because in both cases, if you will say it's a sport facility, there will be the idea of competition, and if it's culture, many people will feel that you have to interact in a particular way, and they want it to be a really, really open space. So basically, it's a factory that has been reused or refurbished to be a space for being, and people, there is like reading, and there are exhibitions, there is a popular cafe, there is a space for sport activities, a swimming pool.
So it's mixed use in one open space?
Completely mixed use, and there is people lying on in the sun, like in a beach, and there is like what I will think is the best architectural example, something that gives you faith again that it's possible to do equitable and interesting cities, and beautiful as well. I think it's a very particular aesthetic, but it's a great example of architecture and this urban mix. What is important is a space that people can use as they want. There is no a particular idea of how to you have to behave in that space. So you can see people, like the multi-generational. People could stay there the entire day, or just go for an exhibition, or just go to have lunch in the cafe. Everything is very economic, and as I said, it's like children, elderly people, and students.
This is mainly leisure. It's not work. It's not living.
No, indeed, but in a way it's what I would expect that a public space will entail, and actually free, or people has also some vouchers to have also meals in some cases, and you can see how people interact to each other. So in this case, it's not mixed in terms of working and living, but in a way like different activities together, making a kind of a social condensator that allows people to use public space, which again in many cities you don't have the luxury to have a safe public space that everyone can feel welcome into.
So this is your mixed functions utopia.
It's my architectural preferred example, yes.
Great.
And I brought another one, perhaps it's an example of a tower in Milan. As a recent example is by Studio Boeri. I'm not bringing it precisely because it's the only example, but it's one of them. And it's an example of a tower of housing that thinks about ecological regeneration. And going back to what Tim was saying about
we don't have the images.
A way of bringing nature to the city is to actually have development in which you account for humans, but also more than humans when you build it. So this tower accounts for the comfort of the inhabitants of the tower, but also the plants that are created and are growing in the gardens, vertical gardens, and the insects and other animals that will populate them. Yeah. So in a way, it's an entire ecosystem in which the humans are not necessarily at the center, but many other beings that are fundamental for the well-being of living in a city are accounted for. So that's another way of thinking about
so not
mixed
human-centered thinking.
It's
much more holistic.
It's a new paradigm that we are seeing more and more in architecture, to say how can we design not only for the human, but actually to take into account many living beings that are in this planet that are necessary for actually being able to continue being in this planet.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have to continue to the next topic because Tim, you work a lot with technology and space. Your company Space Syntax uses technology to plan, to do urban planning. Maybe you can tell us briefly about that.
Yeah, sure. Again, I've got some slides, but I'll try and move quickly through them because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for all of us. But the way in which my practice works is to harness the power of data in order to address some of these very human and biophilic issues. So, we can start with the problem, the traffic jam. I think we also have to recognize this is a problem of history that is about 100 years old. And it started with this plan to demolish the center of Paris, the Plan Voisin, and replace it with skyscrapers and motorways. And it was sponsored by the Voisin automobile company. So I think we need to understand that mixed-use development has a big challenge because it's coming up against 100 years of history. But it has its own longer history. Cities like Barcelona with wonderful streets that are shared by visitors, shared by the local inhabitants. And space syntax as a discipline has been studying how cities are connected, how the streets come together, and how you can use technology like we're doing here to scientifically evaluate the hierarchy, the natural hierarchy where some streets are better connected, the streets in the hotter colors, the red, then the orange, because they're longer, they're straighter, they've got more side streets. And by counting people, by observing, by watching, by using either automatic counters or just going out and drinking a coffee and watching and counting the world go by, we've been able to collect data and understand there's a connection between the street network and the patterns of behavior that happen within them. So we've built algorithms that allow us to design new cities on the basis of a modeling system. I'll just take you briefly through. We can work with communities, and we do, to do this live. So we can use very graphic computing techniques which take the street network, and they take anyone's idea, your idea, the idea of the person across the table from you, to say, well, how should we grow the city? Where should the street connections go? And we can sketch them in, as we're doing here in white, and then run a model that will calculate whether that street is likely to be naturally well used by people. In this case, no, the streets are cold, which means if you tried to open a shop there, it wouldn't work very well. Instead, go back to the drawing board, try a different plan, in this case, a layout that brings the streets around this site together and connects them in the middle, where the flows are going to be higher. And then you can plan that around the pedestrian and around the cycle, plan the retail uses to go on the main streets, plan the quiet uses around it. And so in cities like Melbourne, we're using these techniques to, in this case, it looks like a mixed-use street. It is. It's also a bridge across the railway tracks. It's a living bridge with buildings, shops and offices, a metro system, a bicycle network. And we've talked about public transport. It's so important to the mixed-use city. And so the modeling work that we're doing is showing not only images like this, which are a vision for a monorail system in the city of Jilin in northeast China, but behind all of this, we're using data and modeling to demonstrate, I think, one of the most important points about mixed-use planning, which is that it creates a return on investment. Connected streets, lined with shops, with people living near them, walking to work, taking public transport, make more money than the old way of doing things, creating zones and requiring people to commute in private cars. So I wanted to share that with you to give you a sense of how data and analytics can also support this idea of the mixed-use city.
So actually you use the data as some sort of forecast of how an area can develop.
We do. And that's really important because we've seen so many mistakes in urban planning in the last century. So many places not work the way that they were intended to. And so we use these to try to predict the future and try to show how we can be more scientific and how we can take some of the guesswork out of planning. And our biggest contributor is the historic city, is the city of history that teaches us all the lessons of how to do things. It's a history that we stopped learning from 100 years ago when we all jumped into cars, but it's a history that we're trying to now bring back into the future of cities.
Marina, I see your reaction. What's your response?
I mean, I'm generally as enthusiastic about technology and algorithms as terrified. And to be honest, I believe that the city that is to come is not necessarily that is based only on hard data. And for instance, a project like the one we've seen in Sao Paulo about occupying the street will never have happened if we'll be only analyzing data of movement on patterns. I think it's much more process of carrying, a process of active political engagement and so on that are not necessarily quantified. So for me, data could be a very important ally in planning, but I wouldn't rely only in data because there is the same logic to me as that we were explaining about this rational thinking that was driving the modern city. The same that we use the car to design the city, now we use data. But to me, this rational efficiency as the drivers of the city are not the type of cities I'm aiming for the future. I imagine there will be questions about care, forms of solidarity, or coexistence that are very difficult to quantify. And I believe that perhaps there will be a day in which the ways in which we use data will account for those processes. But right now, we will know that the algorithms have a lot of biases. Amongst them, for instance, racial and many other biases that are clearly making the case that technology is not neutral. So I think...
So you say technology is not only the way to go?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely
I think it will be an aid, but not necessarily the only way. And indeed, it's not... I don't want to think about a future city that it comes from only from the gathering of data and analyzing data. I want something a bit perhaps more politically aware.
What do you think of that, Tim?
Well, I understand the concern, but from my experience, there's a couple of important points. First, that what we're doing with this data is trying to capture the very human qualities of great places. We're trying to record them systematically so we can influence decision takers, work with communities who are, our original clients are local communities who are fighting against this car-centric form of development. And no one had been counting pedestrians until we counted them. And when you can count something, you can talk about it systematically and persuade decision takers to make the kinds of decisions which lead to, I think, the same city that we're all trying to create, which is the city of good public space, the urban buzz, the safe city, the city of diversity. We're all after this same outcome. And from a scientific perspective, we can use data. But of course, as you say, data is not neutral. Data is political. But what we're trying to do is to challenge the conventional traffic model, which is giving us this sterile city that's dangerous to live in. And we're just trying to, in many ways, play them at a better game than the game they've been playing for the last 100 years.
Yeah, Alejandro, what's your opinion? How do you think of using data in urban planning?
I was thinking here, and of course, the technology could help you in many different ways. But at the same time, the challenge is how to connect technology with people. Looking for that the technology integrate people and communities and not separate them, because in our context we have the accessibility to technology is not for all, and in this crisis we saw and we found and very beautiful and powerful examples from solidarity, how the communities react and respond to the urgencies for the crisis. And I agree that if you use the technology, the data, the social platforms, the networks, the dialogues, how to develop a dynamic connections and that empower the dialogues and community to develop agreements and to transform those agreements in programs or actions that connect community with governments and so on, the technology will help a lot. So I think we have, looking forward with this idea how to connect technology with the history of people and the people itself, we have a very, very open future to develop, and the governments has to develop new forms, new paradigms, and new tools to develop a more porosity and more flexible processes that use technology and use the community and the power of the people. So I found in this way that technology could help a lot, of course.
Yeah, so technology shouldn't have the lead, but it should support the decisions you make. Paula, I'm just having a look at you. What do you think? Could data help us? Maybe apply it here in the Netherlands. Could it help us?
I'm a very curious person, so I already use also data. And
you already use it?
I already use it.
In what way do you use it?
Yeah, actually to get insight in the situation. Just things that you cannot count every day to understand better how the cities work. But what interesting is that I use that actually to build scenarios. And it's a very nice instrument to, if you have a scenario that will be never built, you have anyhow something to reflect together with the government, real estate developers. It is good to have something to reflect on, to discuss on, and that can help building scenarios. So,
but then you say it might be the wrong scenarios, or you go beyond
I mean,
things.
I understand the positions, and that's the way we are used to have a scientific knowledge in order to make decisions and convince the people that takes decisions, like government, and makes the money. But in many cases, I think the voice of people is equally important, and that sometimes is not supported by any data. So the right to the people or the right to the city, I think, is something that sometimes is not quantifiable. Sometimes it is, because it's about equality. But in a way, I think we have to strive for having decision-making processes in the city that also account for less data-driven scientific and managerial processes that are only based on, Excel sheets that account at the end for a gaining for some people. Because at the end of the day, we have to convince the real estate developers, but not many times the outcome of those processes are actually good for many. So I'm not saying that I want to put in crisis everything, but I believe that certain languages that are used in designing the cities and urbanism, they should evolve as well. Could be through data and algorithms, but maybe a bit more equal and caring or algorithms.
Yeah, because you at the new institute, you are really focusing on ecocentric urban planning.
Yeah, well, in the different platforms where I work, in the institute, at the Design Academy or the Shanghai Biennial, I work through an ecological perspective, and many of the discussions we are having, as I said before, is how to, in a way, decenter the idea of man from the design. And by doing that, you start to think, and I say man and not human, because obviously it's human as well, but most of the design of cities and architecture has been led by ideas of masculinity as well. And so questions about gender, questions about minorities, racial justice are still topics that had to be accounted for in the design of cities. And especially when we see about mixing, the cities have been designed for a type of work and living organization that is more, supporting of historically the male worker and not the female worker. And how to combine also the raising of kids as families and working environments. So those things as spaces of care has not been accounted for. In many cases, the migrant communities have been always segregated into certain quarters of the city.
But what would be your proposal, for example?
I think in many cases, these ideas of urbanism that we are seeing today, in many cases kind of more conservative ones, but also avant-garde, we will say, have to be redefined. So I think the parameters through which we define a successful city, I think they have to be redefined, and the ways in which we organize the processes, economic and social processes in the city as well. I think there is a fundamental lack of other concepts that are not coming from the rational efficiency that was driving the city of the 20th century and should not be the ones that are driving the one in the 21st. And as I say, we say solidarity or care or accessibility, but also in terms of, housing as not a commodity, but as a right. There are many things that the real estate developers are not going to support, but who is going to?
But that's a change of the whole system, actually.
Well, that's what I would like to see.
Yeah. So we're heading towards the end, and I actually, the two of you are based in the Netherlands, but I'm also curious what you think. What should be the next step in Dutch urban planning?
Well, my pledge in the last years has been well-being and fairness in the cities.
Because now
Now, we also know the situation in the Netherlands that not every city is not everybody can live in every city in the Netherlands. It looks like Amsterdam, not everybody can pay for a house in Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. And health and well-being should be really the first point, because you could use actually the sustainability and making cities green or having less car, whatever it is, new energy systems that should be a mean actually to have a healthy and well-being city. And if you reach that, you have fairness. So, and discussing the data, at the end, you never have a wrong scenario, but you have something where you can discuss and reflect on. And if we talk of fairness, and you see from data that having a lot of parking places and the car for 80% of the time just parked, how fair is to give the space to the cars. So you should reflect actually of this kind of decision and the functions in the city, and try to solve it in a way that mixing the functions, also the spaces with different functions, could be fulfilled for more people.
In an inclusive way.
Giving the right to the city, inclusive way. Yeah, and that is in South America, in Brazil, in extreme, that talking about the right to the city, but actually is also the right. You also could give the right to the city to people, giving them a more healthy city, well-being, not avoiding stress, giving the right to affordable housing, and data could help to get insight and to reflect on it, and actually to transform the system, to reshuffle actually the system, because I, like Marina, don't believe that making the system of now better will be the solution. But fairness and well-being.
Fairness and well-being.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I had in mind there are profound questions in the system beyond urbanism and how we organize society that actually permeate later in how we design cities, and questions of segregation and inequality are very visible. And there are examples now, for instance, in London, and probably they will come to the Netherlands at some point, of towers that have mixed use of people with different income. But at the end of the day, they have different doors. There's the door for the wealthy and the door for the poor inhabitants. So even if you are in the same spot of the city, in the same tower, there are forms of segregation that are manifesting in the public space and in the private space as well. So I'm worried about this type of forms of non-mixing, or mixing that leave the things as they are. So you are apparently mixed. There is a sentence in Spanish that is juntos pero no revueltos. It means like you are together but not mixed.
Mingled.
Yeah. And that's, for me, the worst possible scenario.
Like, pretending as if it's mixed. So you say, if you're going to mix, really mix.
Exactly, pretend that it's mixed, but at the end, the city continues being a very unequal space.
Yeah. So I'm going to end with the two men on the other side of the sea and the ocean. Actually, we're running out of time, so if you have one last, advice to us. I start with you, Alejandro.
Okay, yes. So I think we still have the same problem, some of them, about inclusive and the segregation and so on. But there is one opportunity and a new scenario that is not new, but after the crisis, we learned a lot about this question about rural and urban, and the distances, and how the people could develop and the communities could develop in different way, how the people use the time during the week.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. We're running out of time, so I can't. I have to ask you to keep it a little bit short.
Muy bien. This question about how to develop new forms of use and connections, about the production, about the living in terms of how to transform the relation between rural and urban. Because today we learn that we could work with distances, we could use the time of the week in different forms, and we have a beautiful opportunity that keep a space for new uses in many different places of the city. If we incorporate new logics that we use the space and the infrastructures that are going to be free in terms of the use during the week.
Great, thank you. And Tim?
I would just say I wish we had longer, because I feel like the conversation is just beginning and there is so much to talk about. But for me, the mixed-use city is the city of opportunity. And the way to address all of these inequalities that we're hearing about is by providing people with opportunities. And if you can live closer to where you work, not rely on a car, then you have much better opportunities to address the inherent problems that we've heard described.
So that's the vision we're aiming for. Thank you so much for joining us in this on this live cast. Thank you also here in the studio for being here and adding all your opinions. And thank you at home for watching and for joining. For now, this was the last episode, but in this series of the Metromix, there might come more, but for now, this was it. Thank you very much for watching, and have a very good evening.